afternoon, students. My name is Ndinela Motwanaha, your tutor for history. About the exam question papers for 2021, you have 3 examinations. Each question is 3 hours long. Each question paper is 3 hours long. Each question paper consists of 5 questions, and you are expected to answer all the questions. So you are provided with a study guide, and you should also be able to use NAMCOL Grade 12 History Study Guides. What is that is expected from you? In Unit 1, International Relations. The following topics should be considered when you are studying: the Treaty of Versailles and the aims of Big Three. What is that you are expected to know here? You should know what the Treaty of Versailles is all about. When was the Treaty of Versailles? When was it held, this conference held? Because before they make this Treaty of Versailles, it was first a conference that was held, which is the Paris Peace Conference. So you should know the year when this conference was held, because a treaty is an agreement that was signed as a result of this Paris Peace Conference. So which countries were represented in this Paris Peace Conference? And those countries now that were represented, who are those specific leaders from those countries that were there in that Paris Peace Conference? And plus that, you should also know what were the aims of these Big Three. What were the aims? Because we know the most important discussion points there was about the way forward to bring about peace in Europe, and also to punish Germany as one of the countries they have realized had caused war in the world, the First World War. So now, what were the aims of these Big Three concerning the peace in the world, and also concerning the way forward punishing Germany? The second point, reasons why the Big Three could not get what they wanted. Before you get to the reasons why they could not get what they wanted, you should also consider, for you to be able to get the answers to this question, you should consider that due to some reasons, these Big Three now, they could not really get to an agreement as to what, because of different aims. I don't want to give you a lot of things there, but you should know that due to that they had different aims. At the end, they just ended up not getting what they wanted. So for you to know why they did not get what they wanted, you should be able to know the aims that we have just discussed before. Number 3, you should know the reactions of the Germans towards the Treaty of Versailles. All of us know that the Treaty of Versailles, when it was at the end, when it was signed, it was just inflicted on Germany. Number one, one thing that you should know here is that Germany was never invited in this Paris Peace Conference. So now, obviously, we know they would not react good towards this Treaty of Versailles. And for you to know how they have reacted, you should know the terms that we are going to talk about now. Number 4 is the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. What were those terms? You should know there were five points that were discussed or that were signed as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. So these 3 countries, the Big Three, towards the end of this Paris Peace Conference, they had now to call in Germany and just to make Germany sign. Now, what were those terms? What were those points as a result that they gave to Germany to accept? But remember, without consultations of Germany. Okay, We should also know the impacts of the Treaty of Versailles on the Germans. The word impact, it's bad effects. So these impacts, you should know them categorized in different categories. The impacts economically, the impact politically, socially, how the Treaty of Versailles affected the Germans politically. Think of the army that was reduced. You should know in details what are the bad things that came about of reducing the army, for example, of Germany. Politically, even reducing army, you know that people in Germany depended on the army for employment. And what will happen after that? Most of the people in Germany were employed by this army. So they ended up losing what? Losing their jobs. And losing a job, it makes people to end up, being affected by hunger because there's no income. So you should know how this led to other economical problems. And if there is hunger in the country, what happens after that? So we should know this impact. Socially, we should also know that Germany, because it was not allowed to become a member of the League of Nations, it had nowhere to trade. And those are the social, I don't want to go deep into this, but you should know all the impacts socially, economically, politically, etc. Now let's move on to the justifications of the Treaty of Versailles. Was the Treaty of Versailles fair? Were the big three satisfied with the Treaty of Versailles? So here, you put yourself in the shoes of Germany. If you are saying that Germany is the country that had caused the war, obviously it needed a punishment because it caused great distractions to countries such as France. France also needed to repair its economy, and other countries that were also affected by this war. So you should now make justifications that yes, it was fair to punish Germany, provided that you should give reasons as to why you are saying that the Treaty of Versailles was fair. And on the other hand, it was also not fair. So that's what we mean by saying justifications. You have to justify, you have to give your reasons as to why you are saying it was fair. You should provide reasons, and why you are saying it was not fair. For example, Germany was not the only country that was involved in the war, that it ended up only Germany alone being punished that heavily. And the last one in Unit 1, the extent the Treaty of Versailles caused the Second World War. You ask yourself questions like, could it be that the Treaty of Versailles was fair? If they could have just avoided a lot of things that they, for example, punishing Germany to that extent, after Germany was punished that much, there came great leaders like Hitler. Then he wanted to do to correct all the wrongs that the Treaty of Versailles did. Could it be that the treaty was fair? Was Hitler going to do or to correct the mistakes of the Treaty of Versailles? So you should think from that point how the Treaty of Versailles caused the outbreak of the Second World War. Number 2 is about the Unit 2 is about the League of Nations. What is the League of Nations? When was the League of Nations established? What were the aims of League of Nations? How was the League of Nations structured? The bodies that made up the structure of the League of Nations. And as well as those bodies, for example, the assembly, what are the functions? What does the assembly consist of? How many members made up the assembly? How many countries are represented in the assembly? What are the main functions? What is that the assembly, for example, is supposed to do in the League of Nations? So you should also evaluate the most important body. Should be able to give to find out which of these bodies is the most important body of the League of Nations. Apart from the bodies of the League of Nations and the aims, you should also know the weaknesses. The weaknesses of the League of Nations and how it caused the outbreak of Second World War. The weaknesses of the League of Nations, you connect it to the reasons. What is that made the League of Nations unable to solve to keep its promises? Because remember, we have talked about the aims. Now, for the League of Nations to make sure that it fulfills its aims, now it must do an action. Now, there are some reasons that had caused the League of Nations to fail to fulfill its aims. For example, the membership. Remember, there were some countries that were not that have not joined the League of Nations. Countries like Germany, though it joined in the middle, and then later on, when Hitler became a leader of Germany, withdrew the Germany from the League of Nations. We have countries like USA that was never a member. You should know why, how that, because those are the weaknesses, those are the reasons that contributed to the failures. So we call that weaknesses. And the most important thing here that you should know as a student, you should know these weaknesses and you should differentiate between these weaknesses and the failures. Because in many times, students do not differentiate between the reasons causing the weaknesses. Because the weaknesses are the one that caused the failures. The weaknesses that we are talking about, for example, the countries that were not members of the League of Nations, lack of armed forces, because the League did not have an army. We talk of, the Treaty of Versailles, because it's the one that gave birth to the League of Nations. It was unfair. We talk of, decisions that were being made by the League of Nations. They were taking long to make those decisions. So you should know now how are those weaknesses, how is that weaknesses hinder or caused the failures of the League of Nations. Now, let's move to the failures and the successes of the League of Nations. The League of Nations, when it was established in 1920s, those 1920s, the League of Nations made several successes. And as well, it failed due to the weaknesses in it. So you should know those successes of the League of Nations and the failures of the League of Nations. The most important thing here, students, that I would like you to notice is that the League of Nations had successes, both successes and failures in the 1920s. When it comes to the 1930s, take note of this. There were never successes of the League of Nations in the 1930s. So whenever you get to approach to the question, you should see what the question is addressing. If it's saying 1930s, then you should know that the League of Nations had never succeeded in the 1930s. But if the question is just general, then you should be able to bring in the successes and the failures of the League of Nations in the 1920s. We have the occupations of RE. Remember, students, Germany, one of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was expected to make the reparations. So those reparations, it was expected to make them, a commitment to it. So when it came in 1920s, after the League of Nations was established, Germany made promises that it would start making these reparations. So now it came that Germany took long, and it made promises to France that it had to make these reparations. And remember, when the reparations were made, it had to be given to either France to compensate the damages that they made to France, and also to Britain. So France specifically wanted Germany to pay these reparations, and it took long. That's why they occupied this Re. You have to know the cause to the occupations of Re. The causes, the cause now during the occupations of Re, and the consequences of the occupations of Re. Remember, it cost the economy of Germany to go down, and also cost this money of the currencies of Germany to lose its value. In the 1930s, there was a Great Depression in the world. You should know what the Great Depression is all about, and how it hindered the work of the League of Nations. So for you to know how it hindered the work of the League of Nations, you should know exactly what the Great Depression is all about. And the Great Depression only came about in the 1930s. We also have the Manchurian and Japanese crisis. Manchuria, when did Manchurian crisis happen? What happened in this Manchurian crisis and the Japanese crisis? So you should know what caused the Manchuria to be occupied or to be invaded, and what happened during the course of this Manchurian crisis. In Unit 3 is the collapse of international order. What is order? So it's the collapse of international peace. There was no order. What had caused this in the world? International means worldwide. What happened that there was no peace in the world? So here now you should evaluate Hitler's foreign policy. What do I mean by saying evaluate? You should know how Hitler's foreign policy caused the peace in the world to collapse. But for you to be able to know how this Hitler's foreign policy contributed to the collapse of international peace, you should know the aims of Hitler's foreign policy. What were the aims of Hitler's foreign policy? If you know this, then you would know obviously how it contributed to the collapse of international peace or to the collapse of international order. Number 2, you should know the factors that contributed to the outbreak of Second World War. There are a lot of factors. We can name them, a few of them. The long-term consequences of the Treaty of Versailles, the failures of the League of Nations, Hitler's foreign policy, the appeasement policy. You can name them the Nazi-Soviet Pact. A lot of factors. You should know how they contributed to the outbreak of Second World War. Those are just a few factors. There are a lot of factors that contributed to the Second World War, but those are just a few of the factors. You should also be able to evaluate the appeasement policy followed by Britain and France in the specifically 1930s. And like what I've mentioned earlier, I said appeasement policy was one of the factors that contributed to the Second World War. So what is appeasement policy? What does the word appease, what is to appease? You should know. And this policy of appeasement was specifically meant to Hitler, and it was followed by Britain and France. In another word, they appeased Hitler to do whatever he asked, he was demanding. But at the end, it contributed to the outbreak of Second World War. So what do I mean by saying evaluate the appeasement policy? You should know whether the appeasement policy was a good policy or it was a bad policy by giving reasons as to why you are saying it was good and why you are saying it was a bad policy. We should also know the long-term consequences of the Treaty of Versailles. Like what I've mentioned earlier, I said the long-term consequences of the Treaty of Versailles contributed to the outbreak of Second World War. Remember, we are talking of collapse of international peace or collapse of international order, which means that we are talking of where there was no peace, where there was no order, and eventually it led to the war. And how it contributed to the aggressiveness of countries in the 1930s. What does this mean? Aggressiveness. When a country is aggressive, this is from the word aggressive. When someone is aggressive, is likely to fight. What is that? Because we have talked of countries like Japan invading Manchuria, Italy also invading Abyssinia, which is Ethiopia, and Hitler also invading other countries. So those countries were aggressive. What is that made these countries to attack other countries in the 1930s? Unit 4, it's about Cold War. So in this unit, you should know what Cold War is all about. What is Cold War? And communism. What is communism? Whose idea was communism? And what is that? What was, this war, if you know what this war is all about, it was specifically between two countries. And what is that? What is that had happened? And that is what we meant by the cause of Cold War. So it was specifically between USA and USSR, that is Russia. Now you should know what is that happened during the course of Cold War. And one of the cause during the course of Cold War, there was things that happened like the Berlin Wall. There were countries like, USA, Britain, France. There was a standpoint where they airlifted supplies to West Germany when Germany was divided. You should also know the reasons for division of Germany. Once they have divided Germany, these countries that were working together, because USA was, it had specific countries that were being aided by it. Russia as well was also aiding some countries. What do I mean by saying aiding? It's giving help to some countries. So that's why I said Cold War was specifically between Russia and America. Now, for these countries in the world now, because this was an atmospheric condition, there was in the atmosphere of the world, some countries being aided by Russia, some countries getting help by America. So now there came a point where they also divided Germany. It was due to Cold War. Now, when Germany was divided, there were some at some point where they supplied, they airlifted supplies to the West Germany, because Germany was divided into West and East, and even its capital city was divided into East and West. You should also know a division of Germany in particular. You should also know the Berlin blockade and why they built a wall in Berlin. You should also evaluate in this Cold War who is to be blamed. Was it USA or Russia for Cold War? Unit 5, it's about Namibian history. But this Unit 5, this Namibian history, because Namibian history is divided into two. The Germans' colonial administration over Namibia. And the second one, it's about South African and United Nations. So this Unit 5 is specifically on the Germans' colonial administrations over Namibia. You should know the nature of the Germans' colonial rule over Namibia. If you know the nature of Germans' colonial rule in Namibia, you should first know the reasons or how the Germans established. Remember, there are those certain groups that came to Namibia, the missionaries, the traders, the explorers, the settlers. Now when they came, you should know how they started establishing a German's colonial rule over Namibia. Think of Angra Pequena stories, when they bought, a piece of land. You know how after they established a colonial rule in Namibia, there came a point in 1904 and 1908 where there was a war of national resistance. You should know the causes. Specifically, we have three reasons. The causes: colonial operations, confiscations of land, and confiscations of cattle. You should know now how do those three factors caused the war of national resistance. For you to be able to know those causes to war of national resistance, you should know what war of national resistance is all about. War, obviously we know what war is, the fighting. What is national? National is countrywide. Resistance is when you are fighting back. There obviously should be why they are fighting back. It's because of those three things. But you should know why it contributed, those three reasons, why those three reasons brought people together as a national issue. Why are we calling this a war of national resistance? Now, Namibians have resisted against the Germans' colonial rule. You should know different ways how they have resisted against the Germans' colonial rule. Now, the Germans' colonial rule in Namibia, it has got impacts. We are not only talking about the impacts, you should also know the benefits. Because if you happen to be given a question whether Namibians have benefited, you should also bring in how they have not benefited from the Germans' colonial rule. Because everything has got disadvantages and advantages. So you should know the Germans' colonial rule on Namibian people, it also benefited them as well as did not benefit them. Unit 6, it's Namibian history as well, but this is the nature of South African and the United Nations fighting over Namibia. In this unit, you should know the Windhoek massacre. What are the causes of Windhoek massacre? We know obviously these are the apartheid laws. One specific law, this was the Group Area Act. This was the beginning of the apartheid, the implications. I'm now putting into practice the apartheid laws. You should know what happened at Windhoek massacre. You know why they forced those people to leave old location. You should know why people refused to move to Katutura when they were told to move, and the consequences of this Windhoek massacre. I have already said about this, why old location people refused to move to Katutura. We should also know in this unit the resolution three. It's not resolution 345, but resolution 435. I repeat it, resolution 435. What do we need to know about resolution 435? We need to know the points or the terms of the resolution 435. And how does it help Namibia getting independence? We should also know the reasons for the delay of Namibian independence. In most cases, students confuse the reasons of delay of Namibian independence with other factors. Here, we talk of factors like inclusion of Walvis Bay to Namibia. Why are we saying that it delayed the Namibian independence? It's because it took, a lot of years for these people to make, to negotiate about the exact date when they would bring or they would include Walvis Bay to Namibia. But even Namibia, after Namibia got its independence, these South Africans were never even intending to give Walvis Bay. That's why Walvis Bay was only given back to Namibia in 1994. Can you see that it took long? And the other reason also, I'm not going to give you all the reasons, but I'm just giving you tips, is when the withdrawals of Cuban troops also in Angola. The South Africans said, yes, I'm complying with the terms of the resolution 435, but I'm demanding for one thing, which was the withdrawal of Cuban troops in Angola. So you know that now that process had to take years for the Namibians, the Cubans, the Angolians to make an agreement of when the Cuban troops should leave Angola. Because you know that there was a connection between Namibian, SWAPO, Angola, and the Cubans, Angola MPLA specifically. So they had to make up an agreement, and that agreement for the Cuban to leave Angola was not going to take place in a day. It was not going to take place in a month. Neither even, it took so long. Because that agreement was only reached in 1989. Imagine that was supposed to be made in 1980, but it took place for almost 10 years. An agreement was only made in 1989. So you should also find out some other factors. I was just giving you a tip on this delay of Namibian independence. In this unit as well, you should also know the contract labor system. What is the contract labor system? Why did the South African colonial officials came up with this, the contract labor system? What was this contract labor system all about? And how does it affect the Namibian people? You should know the effects the contract labor system had on the workers themselves who were working on the contract labor system, and also the effects this contract labor system had on the entire Namibian people. Think of the women, because this contract labor system was only taking men. And these men had to be contracted for about 9 months or 18 months. And imagine the whole year, they had to leave their families alone at home. So that's why we are saying that the effects the contract labor system had on the workers themselves, and also the entire Namibians, including their families. Then we move on to the apartheid laws. The apartheid laws, there were various laws that were introduced as far as apartheid concerns. So these laws, you should know specific laws. For example, Group Area Act. passed laws, to name a few, and how these laws affected the Namibian people. For you to be able to answer these questions on the laws, you should study the law itself, how was it implemented, and how it affected the Namibian people. As far as apartheid laws concern, there was also an Odendaal plan that was introduced. This Odendaal plan, it was to make sure that these apartheid laws were applicable or they were implemented. As far as the Odendaal plan concerns now, they have made recommendations, political recommendations and economic recommendations. So you should know now how these recommendations affected the Namibian people. Unit 7, it's on South African history. The apartheid policies in South Africa. And students, one thing you should know is that in South Africa, these apartheid laws or policies that were introduced for blacks in South Africa were the same laws introduced for blacks in Namibia. But one thing that you should know here is that you should know that I'm dealing with South African history now. Then you don't talk of Oshivambo speaking people or the Herero speaking people, but you talk of what? Of the Ventas, of the Zulus, of the Xhosas, of the Tswanas. If you don't want to specify the specific tribes in South Africa or a specific tribe in Namibia, just say black people in South Africa were affected this way, or black people in Namibia were affected this way, so that you do not bring confusions between the blacks, or you say instead of saying the Hereros in South Africa, because there are no Hereros in South Africa. So these policies were the same, but for you now, you should deal with them in the South African context. What are the effects of apartheid on the South African people? But remember, effects of apartheid, this apartheid affected blacks and whites differently. Who benefited from the apartheid laws? Now, when these apartheid laws were introduced, how did black people resist these apartheid laws? This resistance includes the Soweto uprising, the Shovel massacre, the establishment of ANCs, people also letting the world to know about how they felt about apartheid. That brought in also, the United Nations putting economic sanctions to the South African economy. So you should know, in nutshell, you should know how black people resisted against these apartheid laws. The Soweto uprising itself is one of the resistance methods towards apartheid. You should know what Soweto uprising is all about. What are the reasons to Soweto uprising? And how does Soweto uprising contribute to the end of apartheid in South Africa? Factors contributed to the end of apartheid, like what I've said, one of them, Soweto uprising. How does it cause the end to apartheid in South Africa? These factors is a lot of factors. We have the United Nations, we have also the Commonwealth, also, withdrawing South Africa from it. We have also the international countries also, how they have dealt with this apartheid in South Africa. We have individuals like Nelson Mandela. We have individuals like Steve Biko. We have individuals like de Klerk. We have individuals like Desmond Tutu. You can name them. All the factors together. But these factors now, We have internal factors and also external factors. You should differentiate between internal factors. Internal means inside the country. External means outside. You should also know the role played by individuals and political parties in South Africa. What are the individuals? Individuals, I have mentioned them. Who are what are the political parties in South Africa? We have the ANCs. What did the ANC do? It came up with the Mkhonto with Sizwe. We have the PAC. What role the PAC play? What role did they play in the ending of apartheid in South Africa? Now, let's look at the general principles of answering history questions. Each question, when you are going to be given, like for example, question 1 will be having 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. For each question, you only need to describe what is asked in brief. For the first question, in brief, discuss what you do not need any explanation. For the second question, you need to explain in more details of what has been asked. Give reasons and explanation to it. Avoid listing, as this will result into low awarding of marks. This question often asks of how or why, therefore you need to explain how something led to another factor, or if it asks you why, you should as well state and explain the reasons in details. For the third question, it requires you to have a balanced answer. For example, the Treaty of Versailles was fair and unfair. So answer on both sides. You give the reasons for the fairness and you give the reasons for unfairness. This is the end of our presentation. Good luck.